Well, good evening, everyone, to week 6 of our Learning and Educational Technologies course. And this week we're focusing in particular on some aspects of educational policy. And we have a number of people just joining us, Eric, Emma, Damien, and Ben. Now, this week we're getting back into our readings. At a master's level course, we do a lot of academic reading, and we unpack those readings and discuss them. So I'm really hoping you've had a chance to read through the material for this week. Fundamentally, it's around a UNESCO report, which I asked you to read 3 sections out of that. And then there was another paper that summarizes one of those sections. But first, we'll answer any questions you may have over what we covered over the last few weeks, which is around particular ICTs. And we looked at a whole range of ICT tools and ICT integration tools. Then we had a look at a few specifics around educational use of computer games and virtual worlds. And then last week we looked at mobile technologies and learning analytics and learning management systems. So, how are we all going?
In general?
Well, how are you going with your assignment? That's probably a more specific thing that's related to your interest at the moment.
What if I don't get 10 people to do the thing?
What I would suggest is that since I can't really tell if all the people are living human beings, you might be able to simulate a few people. There's various ways of adjusting your research results.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
Now, for a real research study, of course, that would be ethically problematic. But since this is a learning process, you could always add in a few extra people. It's mostly to see that you go through the process. Now, of course, ideally, you could find some really interesting stuff out of doing this process and the learning that emerges from the results of this. But I understand it's your first time through doing these sort of research processes, so the results probably won't be that particularly informative. But that said, as a part of a master's program, it's good to actually have some experience of doing some research. And this is sort of a relatively easy way of introducing you to some aspects of that. Now, Eric asks us how to get them involved into the system using their email addresses. Okay, well, when you create your 1000 Mind surveys, they'll send out the email to your participants, and then they'll click on that link and it'll ask them the series of questions. So I'm not too sure what you're asking there, Eric, in terms of how to get them involved. Now, you probably do need to let them know beforehand that they'll be receiving that email, or you can edit the email as to what goes out to them within the 1000 Minds tool, just so that it puts them into context. Most people don't respond just to random surveys that appear in their email boxes.
Hi, Jason. This is Eric speaking. Hello?
Yes, hi, Eric.
Hi. I just want to express my point is that because during the first step, I finished my survey questions, and then I will add the 10 participants' address into the system, but the address cannot be added. So the problem is that they are not registered in the website.
No, so they don't need to be registered. Okay, now you don't add them as editors, like in that very second or very first step in the process. You've got to go into the, what do we call it?
Distributed processes.
That's it, distributed processes section. And that's where you define the email that goes out to them, and you add in the participants that will be part of your survey.
Oh, not the first step, the second step. Add the address into the first step. Okay.
Correct, yes. You're not adding them as co-researchers, you're adding them as participants, which is a very different part of the process.
Okay, got it. And Jason, another question is how to get the URL link. You said when we
That'll
start
be in the
our
same
survey,
section. When
section.
you go to the distributed the distribution section, there'll be a part in there where you can see the email link or the website link, and you could send that out to them differently to doing the email process if you wanted to do that approach.
Okay, because I remember you said when we start our survey, we need to Hello?
Yes, Eric, you're now non-muted.
No, something happened. So yeah, it stuck. It was stuck
okay.
now.
Okay, well, Emma asks us a question as well. She sent me an invite to the Delphi study to make sure it made sense. Yes, I received a few of those. Unfortunately, I can't tell who actually sends them. The unfortunate part is unless you edit the survey to include your name or something that identifies you, I can't actually tell who's actually provided me with the survey. So I can't actually then email any responses back to you until you let me know. But yeah, happy to provide you a bit of feedback. In general, the main thing to remember is that you're developing a set of criteria that your participants are suggesting are good or bad for answering your question that you're going to be using to rank different things. In most cases, some sort of educational technology. So you're not asking them necessarily to rank the educational technology or various other options. You're asking them advice on the criteria that will be used for developing the ranking, which is a little bit, it's sort of an extra conceptual step.
I've just got a question with the word count. So kind of like when you say put your screenshot of your systems model, underneath that you describe what that is and what it means and do some sort of analysis of it. Is that? You
can, yes. The word counts are there just as a general guide. They're not specific. You don't have to keep to those individual word counts. They were just there to give you an idea of how much effort to put into each of the different sections. The only word count that I'm particularly concerned about is the overall word count. So don't worry about being constrained by those specific subsections. If you want to spend less or more words, and if you've done a good diagram up and you just want to rely upon the diagram, you're perfectly free to do that.
I just want to go on my previous question because it was stuck, the internet, so I didn't hear your answer.
Okay, Eric, you want to ask your question again?
Yeah, my question is, can I just send you my survey questions, Delphi survey questions, you can have a look? And if you think it's okay, I can go on my survey next.
Yes, you can, and I'll give you some general feedback on them. Just make sure that when you send them to me, I know that you've sent them and it's from you. So you may need to edit the email that goes out, just so that I can respond back to you individually, because if you just send out the email automatically, I won't necessarily know that it's you that sent them. Unfortunately, it doesn't specify who the person is that sends the emails. And that's an important thing for everyone to note. When you create your surveys and you want to send them out to your participants, you probably do want to edit that email so that the people receiving them know it's from you and give some sort of background as to why they're receiving this request to complete this survey. Now, if you're doing this for a real research project, you'd go through a whole ethics process and a whole lot of other aspects of doing it as a research task. In this case, we're not doing it as a real research project, so we don't need to go through getting ethics approval and all those other aspects. Now, Ben mentions that he's happy to do a survey of anyone who needs participants. Yes, so that's another good way of getting some additional participants to share it with other course members. And normally it's on a quid pro quo basis where if you do their survey, they also do yours, and you can get some additional people to do your surveys relatively easily during that process. Okay, was there any other questions about the assignment?
Yeah, just quickly, I'm following the same structure I sent you via email over the weekend. It seems to be going quite well. When sort of embedding references throughout, would I be focusing the research of articles in the future scenario section? So like I'm going for like the best case, worst case scenario, and then pulling on references that sort of aid my future scenario, if that makes sense.
I do understand what you're saying, and it's an important point. In the main, you're not being asked to do a detailed research process in terms of coming up with these scenarios, so they don't need to be fully backed by evidence from research. They can just be your opinions in many cases for this assignment. If you're doing this as a proper part of a major research study, most of it would come directly from your participants, and you'd be referencing the research study that you'd done, but you'd also have around that other research that you'd included as part of a literature review and all those other elements. Now, we're not going to that extensive level for this assignment. We're really just doing the method process of the Delphi survey, not backed by a full literature review and study around all the possibilities and options. But that said, if you are using other people's ideas, you should reference them. And most of the ideas that you'll be introducing will probably be in your scenario section. But don't worry, you don't have to have all of your ideas backed by research. That's sort of what I'm saying. You can introduce your own ideas, and I'm not worried about them being supported or unsupported in this case. If that makes sense.
That's great.
Yep.
And also with once I've only got one more participant to take part in the Delphi study. Once they've submitted, would it be wise to incorporate some of the graphs or results within the actual study itself, or is that not necessary?
So this is the graphs from the 1,000 Minds tool?
Yeah, so in the distributed processes, the last sort of tab is results, and you sort of see like some fancy percentage graphs and the criterion weights, and they have like the 5 criterion that I've selected and whatnot. If it's like assisting sort of our scenario or our challenges, would we be wise to put that in there? Or doesn't matter?
No, certainly you can if you wish.
Okay.
Any graph you put in, you should always reference. You should always make reference to. So you should never just include graphs or tables and leave them without any commentary.
Yeah.
But if you want to use them and you feel that they'll help explain the process you've used in the Delphi study, or some of the aspects you want to draw upon that you've used to develop your scenarios, then certainly you're most welcome to incorporate the automatically generated graphs that come from the 1,000 Minds tool.
Great, thank you.
Another question about the assignment. When you're doing the assignment, you kind of want us to do like, you know, a systems model for an organization. Does it have to be like, I mean, because I'm trying to do introduce a learner management system into the school. Should I use that as the systems model and how that would work within the school? Or do you just want how ICT works in the school?
No, you could be very specific around that.
Okay.
And it would then help you when you come to your second assignment. Now,
yeah, that's what I'm hoping for.
Again, the course is a university assignment and not a real research study. I don't really care if it's real or not. You can make up elements and you can adjust things. No one's going to check if your school is exactly how you describe it, or your organization is how you describe it in your systems analysis. But it may be more beneficial to you as in being able to use the results of this process in your own organizations in the future, if you do make it as close to real life as possible. But again, don't include any sensitive stuff that would be problematic, even though no one else is going to see it other than myself as an assessor. You still need to be a little bit cautious in what you share about a real organization.
Thanks. Yeah.
Can I just clarify, coming off the back of Damien's question, that's the system model, the organization system model. And last week you were mentioning like the understanding of the current educational environment which we are in would be preferred. And then it's sort of our challenges are faced based on what we're in, etc. And that kind of goes onto the Delphi study and whatnot. Is that what we're talking about?
Let me just grab the details of that from the assignment. I'm just checking on that so I don't explain things incorrectly. Where are we? So there's the educational challenges facing your organization.
So the point prior to that sort of focuses on just the systems model. And my understanding of that was, you know, I'm describing my current educational environment and culture based around educational technology. And then the challenges would then come after that.
Correct.
Unpacking it. Yeah. Okay. No worries.
And ideally, they should be identified from the system model.
Yes. Yeah.
One of the benefits of doing a good system model is you can sometimes work out what are the major key factors, which tend to be the major challenges that are either inhibiting or encouraging change in an organization.
Cool.
Each of the steps should ideally flow from one to the other. Not necessarily completely, but they are in a sequence for a specific purpose.
And as a mean of sort of like an educational journey, are we explaining this sort of process in our writing? So for example, back doing the sort of connection circle on the Insights website, are we referencing and saying that through this particular model, I was able to create a system model, etc.? Or is that sort of too step-based? Or
you do that, but that's in the very last step where you explain,
reflect.
Yeah, you evaluate and reflect upon and
Sure.
explain the process that was used to develop your understanding. Yep.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay. Yes,
sorry, another question from Eric. Just want to know about the system model. Do we need to give more specific details in the system models when we just design that? For example, so how many items? 15 items or just 10 items? Or we need to consider in that systems model?
In terms of your systems model, how complex does it need to be? I'm just checking the criteria just to make sure I don't tell you something incorrect again. But I don't think I had anything specific around the number of items. But I'm just going to the rubric. So in terms of complexity, the complexity of the system model developed for the selected organization provides insight into the organization and the subsystems involved to significantly improve our understanding of the organization. So you need to include sufficient complexity and subsystems. So if there wasn't any subsystems, so if there wasn't any identifiable groupings within your system model, that would be a little bit of a problem. But the primary that we're looking for is that you've gained a better understanding of the ICT challenges facing your organization from the system model. So it's how well you explain what you've learnt about the organization from having completed the system model. Now, you may be able to do that from a very simple system model, but there's no specific number of nodes within the system that you need to work through. That said, I wouldn't expect you to go into too complex a model. It'd be very easy for an educational organization to have a very, very complex system model. Don't spend an inordinate amount of time making a system model that covers every aspect of education. There would be thousands of factors that could be included. But that said, you do want to include enough factors that you can show some insight and understanding from the interrelationships between those factors. So I would say 10 factors would be a good number to be focusing around. 10 factors around the circle, and then the interrelationships between those factors, and developing that into a system model should provide you with enough insight to be able to then develop some challenges from that.
Question, Jason. So my system model doesn't so much specifically talk about technology, but I've made inferences which I've then written in my essay about how technology can then aid that. Is it okay that my system model doesn't have too many connections to technology, although my explanation and the rest of the essay does lead towards that, if that makes sense?
That's fine, Emma. In fact,
Okay.
A good system model will incorporate lots of different elements that are related to the questions that you're looking at, and that can often provide insight into the challenges facing the organisation. And technology is generally a tool for addressing problems. So as long as you can identify problems or challenges or opportunities, you can then explore how technology can assist in addressing those. How you identify them doesn't necessarily have to rely upon interactions with technology itself.
Yep, cool.
Okay, so that's everything on the assignment then for this evening, and we'll get into some questions or some looking at some system models that have been used in real life, exploring some educational change in various contexts. So I'll share the document, first one we're going to look at. So this was a document from UNESCO looking at the transforming education and the power of ICT policies. And there are 3 chapters from this document I'm hoping that you've read, chapters 1, 2, and 6. I just want to remind, did we look at learning and did we finish off looking at mobile learning environments?
I feel like we've jumped ahead.
Yes, that's what I'm just thinking. I might have jumped ahead a little bit for you. Okay, let's have a quick look at mobile learning environments and we'll pop back to this one. One moment. Okay, so there was one other document that we're going to look at around mobile learning environments as another specific ICT for us to explore. And I'll just bring this one up. Who's had a chance to look at this document? And if you're typing in chat, I can't see you. Emma's gone nope and yep. Okay, well, let's have a look at the mobile learning pedagogies then. So this is another set of ICTs that are being used a lot in schools at the moment. Now, some of you may remember well, some of you probably don't remember, but Australia was the very first country to introduce one-to-one laptop programs in the 1990s. Since then, they've become quite popular throughout the world, but we did have the advantage of being first in that space. And then a few years later, in 2008, we had the digital education revolution, where the Australian federal government provided enough computers in schools for every student from years 9 to 12 to have their own computer or access to a computer for use during their schooling. Now, since 2013, there's been some challenges in maintaining that level of investment. But, well, I'll leave that to you guys. So has anyone had any experiences of a one-to-one program or the digital education revolution in terms of providing resources into schools?
Yes. So the current year 12s are sort of the last grade to have a one-to-one device, which is proving difficult because teachers are now, who previously had planned to have devices in the classroom, now have nothing at all. So we're pretty low SES at a BYOD program. So it sort of fell apart after we lost funding. And that's essentially where we're at now and the challenges we face with very low levels of technology throughout the school.
Yes, that's a common story across many schools at the moment, as the one-to-one equipment that was provided through the digital education revolution has run out, and they're going beyond their lifespan of use. Schools are now looking at ways of addressing that, and BYOD programs are a very popular way of trying to shift the costs where the school can't manage to provide the ongoing costs for the provision of that equipment. Anyone else got any examples? Or from your own education or your own countries, if you've been involved in computing in other environments? At universities, we've tended to move towards a one-to-one BYOD program before schools did, although we still maintain quite a lot of on-site laboratories where particularly our international students maintain access to computer equipment and the internet to be able to pursue their studies. Okay, well, we'll move on then. So there's been a number of initiatives around providing computers to students. In 2005, there was the One Laptop Per Child program, which was aimed at providing a laptop to every child on Earth. And the idea was to have these laptops cost around about $100. And they were provided to a number of countries, including Australia. We have One Laptop Per Child programs that operated in the Northern Territory and Northern Queensland, particularly in Aboriginal communities. And these provided a range of different devices. They weren't fully very high capacity laptops. They were fairly low capacity, but they allowed students to do internet access and word processing and basic programming and things of that nature. And there's a number of videos and clips that you can have a look at that can explain that particular program. But the idea essentially is that students can do a lot if they've got access to their own devices. And they can then extend their learning outside of the classroom. And they can incorporate a whole lot of other ongoing learning processes that if they're only using a shared device or a device that they've got access to every once in a while, don't allow them to have that continuity of learning and access to resources and online activities and applets and all the rest that students that have access to a device and can maintain ownership of that device may have. So on from that, we then have tablets, which have been very popular in many schools. The iPad was introduced in 2010 and became very popular in schools because it was at a price point that was below the need for schools to go through a central office to purchase. And so they were quickly adopted by many schools, particularly primary schools. And they didn't rely upon a large scale infrastructure that a lab or even a laptop program often required. Now that said, tablet devices don't have the full capacity of laptops or desktop devices, but they've increasingly had a number of improvements in terms of their capacity to run software, and the software that runs on them has improved dramatically. But they've also got some advantages of other mobile devices, being generally they've got a camera included and a microphone, and so they can be used to take videos and take recordings and create podcasts and videocasts and a whole lot of things that, well, now most laptops also have the capacity, but back when they were first introduced, were really a special place of the tablet devices. And now there's lots of different tablet devices. The Android devices are very popular. There's the $35 Akasha that was developed in India and designed to provide every student in India with a tablet device at a very low cost, and a whole range of other things. So what's some experiences people have had with tablet devices?
Yeah, with tablets, students and teachers can read books. We can receive emails. We can access to learning resources. So the traditional books has been transformed into the electronic one.
Yes, digital books have been a major factor around tablet devices, particularly outside of education, somewhat surprisingly, given the amount of focus we have in education on books and textbooks. But slowly we're also seeing that occur more and more in schools. And indeed, there are some schools that have really embraced digital texts. Here on the Gold Coast, St Hilda's produces several dozen digital textbooks that all the students have access to and use through their iPad devices. And the whole school infrastructure is built now around teachers producing these digital texts and updating them and maintaining them and integrating them into students' learning. And increasingly, we're also seeing students creating their own digital texts.
Yes.
Yes, Eric.
Yes, Jason. And yeah, one question is that even if the tablets are so convenient for people to use, but I still think the paper books are kind of solid knowledge. Because take me for example, I still like books. I still like to put the books on the desk and you read it one page by page, one by one, and it's kind of solid knowledge. But for the electronic ones, your tablets can receive so lots of information, so that you don't know which kind of information or which kind of books is useful for you, and you just skip. So at last, you have still just have learned little knowledge from that one.
Yes, you raise a number of issues around the distinction between digital and physical texts. And yes, you're correct. People that have grown up with using physical texts do tend to prefer those, although that is changing. But tracking the uptake of and sales of physical text versus digital texts, generally the population is moving quite rapidly towards digital texts. And even in libraries to help, they tend to purchase more digital texts than physical texts. So I do agree there is a different experience with using a physical book as opposed to a digital book, including through the learning process of being able to tag and bend corners and mark up. Many of those facilities are available with digital texts, and people are slowly learning those. But there's also some advantages of digital texts, being able to search and combine and reformat text and separate text into lots of different sections. For educators, being able to choose chapters from a whole range of different textbooks and build your own textbook out of a whole lot of different sections from other resources. So there are advantages and disadvantages to both systems, but pretty much overwhelmingly, there's a very strong trend towards the digital format, primarily because of cost in many instances, although that has caused a few problems. California went very quickly towards replacing all of their textbooks, which was a several $100 million industry, because they had a lot of students and a lot of textbooks, and they decided to rapidly change to digital text and made a big mistake and had to then rescind that and try to fix the problems that were then caused by doing that too quickly. So change is sometimes difficult and complex, and while it seems a logical step to save millions of dollars by having digital text rather than having to replace student textbooks continuously as they become worn and outdated, there are challenges around the use of any technology and implementation processes, as you'll uncover when you come to your own implementation plan for your assignment 2, do need to consider the potential failure points when coming up with new innovations. But what are some other advantages of digital texts over non-digital texts? And as you're thinking of that, I'll respond to Emma's question or statement. Digital art has moved towards tablets. Yes, art actually started using tablets before we had iPads and those sort of tablets. Back then we used to call tablets things that you could draw on, and they would digitize using a device like this, and it would then digitize onto a screen. Now that we've got tablet devices which have their own screen built in, we can now draw straight onto the screen, and the recent versions of both the Android and the Apple tablets now have pens available that you can then draw onto the tablets very much as you would draw with pencil or ink on a piece of paper or canvas. But again, there are many artists and art teachers that prefer non-digital forms of creation of art. And there are advantages and disadvantages to both systems, as with any new technology. But back to the general advantages of digital over non-digital.
I'm
Emma
still
mentioned the very...
discovering that.
Okay.
I think because I previously was at a school that had one-to-one iPad devices, and while they are great for sort of research online and media classes and whatnot, I found it really difficult to control and restrict what the students were actually going on. There was no sort of I guess management system around what apps they could download or stuff like that. So I found I was combating a lot with, you know, social media and taking photos of their friends and all those sort of general behavior stuff. And it got to the point where teachers were getting so frustrated that even a camera was on the iPad. So it was really hard to just control in that sense, even though they are great.
No, you're absolutely correct. And they offer a whole range of classroom management challenges. As with any new technology, there are changes and how we actually cope with that and integrate those processes and potentially change our pedagogy to incorporate the better use of those technologies. And there are times when you may want to restrict the use of technology because you want to focus students on specific tasks, and that's an appropriate thing as well. So as with any new technology and any implementation, there are challenges and advantages and disadvantages. But overall, there does seem to be a very strong move towards the digitization of devices into classroom use. And it's really ways of managing that rather than on choosing between going digital or not going digital. Now, Emma mentions very useful for differentiation. And yes, one of the advantages of digital texts in particular is that you can have many different documents. And so instead of being able to purchase just one storybook for your class, you may be able to have access to a digital library of thousands of storybooks and choose specific ones for different students based upon their reading levels. Access to resources, because of the cheapness of distributing information and resources digitally, can become much less of a problem. Where in the past, actually having to purchase and store and manage a whole range of books would be very difficult. Now you can have libraries of tens of thousands of books on an individual device. And so differentiation becomes much more feasible. Okay, well, let's move on and have a look at a couple of other issues around mobile technologies. Okay, so one aspect of mobile-based learning we haven't actually touched on is the whole fact that they can be mobile. And this can open up a whole range of new ways of actually learning, where we can actually take our devices and go to different places, or have students separate and go to different places and do things remotely. So it's one aspect to really think about in terms of having these mobile devices, is that we need to actually think about how to actually use them as mobile devices. So one aspect we talked about is having a camera on them so students can move around and take photos of different things. So the city experience was an excursion. Well, it was actually a camp that students in, I think it was Sydney, from MLC, they had a camp in the middle of the city and stayed there for a week and had excursions to all different locations within the city. And they were instructed on where to go through their device, and they had to take photos and create podcasts and so forth of their experiences in a city. And a whole range of other tools that are available to do mobile-based activities. Project Noah was one where the students are documenting wildlife and flora and fauna. And Frequency 1550 is another one where they're using history education to explore different time periods and movement around different spaces. So the whole idea is to actually move around with your devices and use them as a mobile tool. And then we have a whole area of augmented reality where we can actually create stories and have overlays on the real world through our mobile devices. Does anyone have any examples or experiences with using mobile devices while mobile?
Outside.
Oh, so go on.
Do you mean like outside of the classroom?
Well, it could be outside the classroom. You can have mobile activities inside a classroom as well, but in the main, they're often outside the classroom.
Yeah, we walk around taking pictures of things and use those photographs to, well, the students use the photographs, like if you're looking for angles in the real world or something like that.
Yep. Now, Emma mentions Twitter, and Twitter is certainly a useful sharing tool where we can share what we're doing, and sometimes you can share your location and things like that. And it's useful for having a conversation, and you might be moving around and continuing that conversation, but it's not necessarily reliant upon a location. There are a whole range of tools and technologies that can rely upon locations, one of which are beacons, where you can have these different devices that recognize where you are and provide your mobile device with information based upon your location. But let's have a look at some of those aspects. So, as Emma mentioned, you've got social media tools such as Twitter and Facebook and things of that nature, where students can maintain a microblog of what they've been doing and what they're contributing to. It might be around a project they're working on, or while they're on an excursion, or while they're reading a book. And it can be part of a reflective process, or it can be part of a collaborative writing process, a whole range of other aspects that you can incorporate in. Then you've got all the different mobile apps that you've got available for your devices. And there's literally thousands upon thousands now. Some are around creating things, such as story creators or book creator. And students can create their own ebooks. Then students can create their own apps. And we've got tools such as AppBar and MIT App Inventor, where students can create their own apps. So it might be an app to help them with their assignment, or an app they've created that helps solve a problem in their community, such as looking after people in an aged care home, or things that the students have created as a project. And there's a range of app-based tools. But the other aspect there is around technologies such as beacons and a range of, okay, a beacon is a little, just see if I've got one here. They're little devices that you can put around your classroom, and then as students move their mobile device near them, some information will appear on their screen. I set up one at a school on the North Coast where they had a rainforest walk. And as they walked through the rainforest, they would come to a tree or a bit of a little lake or a stream, and there would be a beacon placed there, and the mobile device would detect that, and it would play a little video clip or an audio clip related to what they were experiencing. But you could do the same in a classroom. You might have a whole series of different displays around your classroom, and as students move to each of those displays, their device would then be triggered to play a different video or display certain information or a web page about what their the information is about that particular location. Some schools set those up as school tours, where parents can be given a mobile device, and as they walk through the school, as they go past the Year 5 classroom, it would then start playing a little video of all the different things the Year 5s have been doing during that year. And as they keep walking, they come to the Year 7 classroom, and it plays another video. And it's just a way of providing information based on your location. Now, there are other tools that do that, that rely upon your GPS location with many mobile devices now, and various other technologies that are emerging that can do those sort of things. Now, Emma mentions that she's missing the city. What aspects of the city are you missing, Emma?
Just all the like how much technology you have access to. I'm so jealous. I've got so little of it out here that just listening to those ideas just makes me wish I was back there, because it's just impossible out here. We could never do that type of thing. We're in the community that I'm in, so it's making me wish I was back already.
Yes, we'll get on to discussing some of the challenges related to different communities in a second in the next section. But you're right, sometimes access to equipment and technology is much easier in certain centres. That said, there is a lot of technology that's involved in rural and remote communities, simply because they need them for communications and so forth. And a lot of farming communities in particular use a lot of technology, where they have remote sensing for all their farm equipment and their animals and various other aspects. But in the main, yes, resources do tend to cluster with population, and it can be more challenging in remote areas. Okay, so that's probably enough around the mobile technologies, unless anyone's got anything else they'd like to add or discuss around mobile technologies. And I'm guessing not. Okay. Let's then have a look at these readings. Now, knowing that you probably haven't done the readings, it's a bit more of a challenge, but let's have a go anyhow. If you could open them up so that you could follow along and possibly even read ahead. So this is the first one around transforming education through the power of ICT policies. So the whole idea of this is that technology and educational technologies can have the ability to transform how education is done. And in particular, this study is looking how it's done in different countries. But what I'd like you to understand is that the difference between countries can also be the differences between locations within a country, such as what Emma was talking about in terms of differences within the rural and remote areas versus the more populated areas. But also there could be differences between socioeconomic status within even a city. We've got some communities in some areas that have got certain access to technologies, and other areas where they've got very different access to technologies. So while this study in particular looks at the differences between countries, you should be able to relate that to within your own educational environment, even down to a single classroom, where, or say within a school, you may have certain classes that have got greater access to resources than other classes. In many cases in schools, we've got a difference between secondary schools and primary schools. But even within a primary school, there's normally a strong difference between the year 7 and 8, or year 6 and 7, or 5 and 6 classes, and the prep or year 1 and 2 classes in terms of access to resources. But even within an individual class, you may have different students that have got different access to technologies and resources at home, or even in the classroom if you've got BYOD programs where students can bring in resources from home. So all of the issues around access and availability of ICTs can be related at various levels. But the policies that inform how we deal with that access can also be related at those different levels. So, in this particular study, I'm just jumping to chapter 1, looking at the technological, economic, and social context for educational policy. Now, policy simply means the decisions we've made in how to implement a particular program. In this case, it might be a BYOD program, or a one-to-one laptop program, or the use of iPads in a school, or the access to the internet. Any of these things have a policy around them, even if it's an unstated policy or an unwritten policy. Now, at a national level, tends to be we write them down. But in a school, you may not write those down, and certainly you wouldn't probably write them down in a classroom. But overall, there's been a dramatic increase in the power of computers and of ICT in general. We had telephones introduced into schools in the 1800s, and then in the 1900s, in particular the later half of the 1900s, we had the internet and the World Wide Web. And how that's been distributed around the world is very different. Many countries now have got access to televisions, but there are countries that don't have access. Indonesia, it's still only about 65% that have got access to television. And in India, it's about 50%. So while we're talking about access to the internet and things like that, other things are quite different. In Poland, for example, they've got quite low levels of access to telephones, but very high access to mobile phones. And likewise, personal computers have got widely different access levels around the world, as with the internet. In India, internet access is very low compared to other countries. In the United States, it's around about 62% of people have got access to the internet. In India, it's about 1%. That's quite different in terms of opportunities that then arise from those technologies. But just to give you an idea that there is a whole range of disparity around technology. Okay, so there's a range of different paradigm shifts that we have then from that. Generally, we've moved from a mass production paradigm to an information technology paradigm, and how technology is now allowing us to do many different things. Now, the mass production paradigm was all reliant upon technology as well. The steam engine, all of those technologies changed the way we worked in society. We went from an agricultural base to an industrial base, all through the introduction of technology. We had transportation systems that could then move goods around the world, where in the past you could only generally purchase goods that were from a nearby town or city. But now we're in an information technology paradigm, which is changing things again. Now we're very much looking around niche products and niche markets, globalization and being able to purchase things from anywhere in the world. And knowledge is now becoming increasingly valuable, where we can actually generate value by simply creating more information and better ways of accessing information. So lots of changes happening around that. And of course, many of those things have impacted upon education, but differently for different countries. Likewise, differently for different areas within a country and potentially different areas within a school. But ICT is the area we're focusing on, and in particular, the impact of ICT on education. So one of the biggest aspects around education is, of course, whether or not students' learning is improved, and whether or not ICT can actually help improve students' learning. And you'll see arguments for and against this all the time. In general, though, the studies have shown that there is a positive benefit from ICT integration into schools. And you can read some of the stats there. In particular, it was found useful around computer tutorials in mathematics, science, and social sciences. But also, simulations were particularly beneficial in science. And in primary schools, where students used technology to help with their writing, it improved their reading scores as well. When they were become more practiced at writing their own stories, Their writing skills improved a bit as well, but in particular, their reading skills improved. Okay, so let's have a bit of discussion on that before we go on. So what are your views on the impact of ICT?
Coming back to the equity issue of it, really.
It is.
You know, like it's like so many countries have so many computers, but some don't. And if ICTs are supposed to be so good for education and improve it, then what happens to the countries that don't have access to it? Then do they not have a good education?
Essentially, yes. But the same has been true of all technologies, down to the book. The book is simply a technology. There are many schools currently in Africa and other areas which don't have access to textbooks. In some cases, even writing books, being able to write with pen and paper. So levels of access to technology have always been an issue. And it relates significantly to the levels of wealth in a country, but also the priority placed on education and the priority placed on providing access to these resources. That said, technology can be a great leveler. While it does have a significant initial increase in cost, having access to a tablet device or a digital device of some sort that can connect to the internet. Once you have that device, you've then got access to resources relatively equivalent to what countries that have got a much greater wealth and access to resources have. So for example, if you took a whole lot of, let's say, the one-to-one laptop program and gave them to a school that didn't currently have any textbooks at all, suddenly the school has now got access to tens of thousands of textbooks and tens of thousands of digital resources and other resources. So it's a really, really significant jump in terms of provision of access and resources. Yes, you've got some initial technological barriers. You do need electricity. And there are schools that have great difficulties getting electricity. But that said, there's potential hope in leveling the playing field significantly if we can overcome some initial technological barriers with ICT. But what do people think about that?
I think my focus isn't more so country specific, but suburb specific. So, for example, the two schools I'm been working between are 15 minutes apart from each other in driving distance, and one has a iPad in every single classroom. Every single student has one. The one I'm currently at, nothing at all. So I guess for me, as an educator, I'm adjusting my craft for the learning outcome regardless of the technology, if that makes sense. And I think that if you are an effective educator, you have to do that. That's just how it works. You have to make it work with what you've got.
You do. And a teacher can still teach even if it's stick in a piece of dirt. But that said, the technology can assist greatly in many respects.
It can also be really disruptive though, because if you've got technology and teachers don't know how to use it, the teaching might suffer and they mightn't be as good as they used to be. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Yep. Now you're absolutely correct with that, and technology can have a really negative impact upon education. We saw that with the introduction of the electronic whiteboards and the whole move towards doing PowerPoint presentations as opposed to other pedagogical approaches, where it became very much a return to teacher-directed instructional models, where we had been moving away from that. So technology can have a big significant impact upon pedagogy. And yes, if they aren't managed correctly in a classroom environment, they can be very disruptive because students can utilize them for other things other than the controlled environment that many teachers are used to maintaining in their classroom environments. So there are challenges around various technologies, and we do need to consider their benefits and whether or not they outweigh the disruptions or the challenges involved. But that said, when effectively used and effectively managed, they can be very beneficial to the learning process. But for the main thing we're focusing on tonight is the issue of differences. And yes, the differences between two schools is very much the same as the difference between two countries. And we need to try to make sure that all of our students have got good educational opportunities. And if ICTs are a factor in that, then we need to make sure that all of our schools have got access to ICT. Now, that was a big part of the digital education revolution agenda, to provide access to physical resources. It's been a big part of the NBN, which did have a large educational aspect when it was first envisaged. And in the main, schools are slowly moving towards provision of access. The whole issue around taking NAPLAN online had a hidden agenda around ensuring that all schools have got a base level of technology access to be able to meet the needs of education. Immediately to meet the needs of being able to do an online test, but in order to meet that need, schools will also have to achieve, or also have the facilities then, to use that technology for other pedagogical purposes. So, yes, there are big differences, just as there are big differences between countries. And how we then utilize those technologies that schools do have available can be very different. That said, there can be some really significant learning outcomes achieved with very little in terms of technology, that sometimes in schools that have lots of technology, because they've become very complacent with the access to technology, they don't take the advantages of the technology as significantly as schools that have to make do with very little technology. Now, of course, it'd be fantastic if every school had lots of technology, but I've seen schools that are making do with one computer per classroom, doing things that are exceeding what are being achieved in schools where every child has got a laptop, simply because of the creative ways they're making use of the tools. Now, you do have to be creative. You've got to share the resources. You've got to do other things when you don't have physical access to the technology. But there are still lots and lots of things that can be done. Okay, let's keep having a look at the document. So one of the big things is around teacher use of the ICT and how teachers know how to use the technology, as has been mentioned. But there are access barriers and how they can be used, whether or not policies are set in place that prevent them being used effectively, or issues around electricity is a significant issue in many places. We don't necessarily have that problem in Australia, but we do have issues around internet connectivity in some schools. Now, Chapter 2 takes this idea and starts looking at ways we can actually transform the way we do education through the use of technology. So, again, we've got those two paradigms. And they introduce this idea of a knowledge ladder. So we've got 4 steps. The first step is that we need to provide the skills needed to have a basic educational approach and the technology needed for that. So being able to provide access to knowledge and access to information. So that may be through books, or it may be through access to the internet, or just fundamental basic educational approaches, which might be direct instruction and things of that nature. And that may be through provision of TVs or data projectors and things of that process. Now, the next level up from that is knowledge acquisition, where we're providing computer labs and data projectors for PowerPoints, and equipping schools to transmit knowledge and have students acquire that knowledge. Then along our pedagogical structuring, we've got knowledge deepening. This is where we take the knowledge that we've got and we go into more detail about that. So it may be students doing audio interviews of other people and creating video clips and increasing their engagement with the knowledge that they've received and understanding and unpacking that in greater depth. And then we've got knowledge creation, where the goal is for students to start creating new knowledge. So taking their understanding of various things that they're learning about, and then trying to create some new knowledge about that. So maybe in science, trying to do their own experiments to better understand the water quality of their creek system, and creating a database and collection of knowledge about that that scientists might be able to use, or other people might be able to use in their community. So very much going into the more real world application of creation of knowledge, where students are actually working towards improving, going beyond the educational processes involved, but by being knowledge creators, it deepens their learning processes as well. Now that has a whole range of policy issues as to what level you could actually accommodate in your particular school or country or even classroom. You may have some students who are only at the knowledge acquisition stage. Some might be at the knowledge deepening stage, and you may have a few gifted and talented students that are at the knowledge creation stage. Likewise, in schools, they may have the technology that can only support certain pedagogical approaches. That said, most of those pedagogical approaches can be adopted with very low levels of technology. It's just how you really approach it. So I don't quite agree with the model presented here that you need a lot of ICT to be able to do the knowledge creation and knowledge deepening stages, but that's the model presented here in this document. Just quickly moving through this. So the idea of policy is to try to move things along those, in this case, those 4 stages. So the vision is to have everyone move towards knowledge creation, and this might be the vision that you have for your school or your educational system for your second assignment. And then there'll be some steps along the way to achieving that, and then some strategies to make that happen. Professional development, changing pedagogy, changing the curriculum, changing your assessment processes, maybe restructuring the school, changing the time frames when people turn up to school, maybe changing the spaces involved in the school. And because this course is around technology, there'll be certain technologies that are needed to support those changes. The technology infrastructure in terms of access to the equipment and the internet and things of that nature, but also software and networks and various other elements that you could incorporate into your development plan to move your school to where you want to see it. So in this case, they're moving it from basic education through to knowledge creation, and they've got a whole range of strategies to do so. So now's your chance to do some talking. What do you think of those processes?
I think it'd take a long time to definitely jump from a basic perspective, and even that next level, whatever it was, the knowledge, next knowledge, it'd take maybe a few years for it to even move that step, because if it's across a P to 12 school, for example, that might look very different for primary to high school, or depending what technology you get, that might also look very different again.
Absolutely, and any significant change of that nature will take many years, and the plans that you come up with will reflect that. You can't expect to make a significant change in any organization in a very short time frame. There's a lot of factors to be incorporated and a lot of barriers to be overcome, and your implementation plans will reflect those processes. But that's also why we then have staged approaches, where we move from stage to stage, realizing that to go to the final stage is far too ambitious. We have to go through several stages before we can eventually get to that final stage. And sometimes there are different strategies needed for each different stage.
Surely if it takes so long to jump between stages, wherever technology develops in other areas, they'd be behind, if that makes sense. Is sort of by the time they've already developed, things have changed again, or technology has advanced again. Is that the case?
Now, it's a very good point, and it's a very significant one, and UNESCO looks at this all the time. But there are opportunities to jump stages, and China's certainly done that in a number of different areas, and different technologies in different parts of their society, and other countries can do so as well. So we used to have a model based upon the European model of everyone progressing to industrialization and then slowly progressing through to information societies and then to a technology-based society and so forth. But in more recent years, we've come to a better understanding that it is possible to jump various stages, and you don't need to progress along the same speed as what countries that may have initially gone through that process. So, for example, many countries in Africa now have skipped over the whole idea of trying to put telephone networks across the entire country, and they've gone straight to mobile technologies. So a step that saved them many, many billions of dollars and have allowed them to advance to a significant level of technology use by not having to go through the processes of that other countries went through in putting in wired systems. So while yes, there are aspects around that, and technology always does keep moving forward, it is possible to accelerate and to skip over stages. And probably the biggest example of that is China, but also Japan and some other Asian countries have also jumped very rapidly in their engagement with technology and industrialization and so forth. And that can be the same in a school. If you've got a school that hasn't had technology for a long, long time, and maybe the school gets a grant and suddenly you've got enough iPads for everyone, if the teacher and the school have set up their policies correctly to integrate those iPads into making it an effective use in the school, then they may be able to jump straight into doing things with these high-tech mobile devices without having gone through the process of setting up computer labs and then slowly moving from computer labs to laptops and then slowly moving from laptops to tablets, for example. Other thoughts?
Just on that, with the whole jumping from computer labs to laptops and iPads and whatnot, I'm sure, and I've seen it before, that teachers who have been teaching for 10, 20 plus years struggle with the concept of rapid change. And I think going from a laptop or a desktop computer to a mobile device like an iPad, I've seen a lot of older teachers, or more experienced teachers, not actually interacting with the iPad because they don't believe it's necessary. And I think that could be an issue around professional development or processes in itself.
No, absolutely. And professional development and change management is a big part of any implementation plans. And you're absolutely correct. There will be resistance and there are strategies and processes, but that's the same with anything, pedagogy or technology. And in 15, 20 years' time, you'll be faced with the same challenges as they are currently faced as we move to direct brain implants and whatever else emerges with technology by then. And it'll seem just as strange to you as iPads do to some teachers now. So other thoughts? So eventually you'll be coming up with your own implementation plans. We're going to go through over the next few weeks a whole range of different strategies and approaches you'll be able to take to construct these plans. But part of that will also be identifying what your vision is for your educational organization and the sorts of things that you'd like to see in that organization. So now let's look at a particular country study where they've gone through this process, and we'll have a look at how they went. So this is chapter 6 of the text. I think I've gone a bit too far. There we are. So Uruguay. So they had a country of 3.5 million people and hadn't been doing very much at all to do with technology in schools. And if you're not sure where Uruguay is, it's in South America, just below Brazil and next to Argentina. So not a particularly wealthy country, And they had lots of telephones, and quite a few computers and internet access. So they then went through a process of working out, okay, what could they do with their access to technology to improve education? Where is it? So there are a number of things that they were looking at. They're wanting to have issues around equity to make sure that all their students have got access to good education. They also wanted to see if it could improve their democracy. They also wanted to see it change their whole nation. So when we talk about revolutionizing the classroom, some countries look at ICT integration as a way of actually changing their entire nation from one type of nation to another. And a whole lot of other issues that they were exploring. So this was their systems analysis that they looked at in terms of all the different issues around their education system, all the different departments and groups that were involved in planning the education system, from the universities through the schools, their assessment bodies, their early childhood bodies, all the rest. And they started sort of exploring how they interacted with each other. And okay, then they developed a whole lot of policies. So these were their objectives and things that they wanted to try to achieve. They wanted to have the universal secondary education, so have everyone go to secondary education, and a whole range of other aspects that you do at a national level. And then they developed an ICT policy that would support that. So here they chose to use the 1 laptop per child program. This was those low-cost laptops that were available, and they were to provide them with to all their students. So they were, so they had 300,000 or so students in 2,000 schools. And where was it? How many did they implement? Okay, so their objectives were to provide all children and teachers of public primary schools universal and free access to portable computers in order to reduce the digital gaps in their country. So every child in primary school was to get their own computer. And the idea was also to promote social justice and equity and facilitate the construction of new learning environments, et cetera, et cetera. So these were their goals and their vision. So they had the advantage of investing into lots and lots of equipment, but it did cost them a fair bit of money. And then they had a range of challenges. Not the least was around professional development of their teachers to be able to use all of these computers that were suddenly available now into their schools, providing wireless internet connectivity to all their schools, and development of a whole lot of educational resources to go on these devices to improve the educational outcomes of their students. So just having the technology itself wasn't sufficient. That was only one aspect of the implementation, just as having a whole lot of laptops put into a school would only be one aspect of all the aspects that would need to be looked at in terms of using it in a school or a classroom. So just having every student suddenly have a tablet device in your classroom means you've also got to think about, okay, can we have enough wireless connectivity for all the students to be able to use those devices at the same time in a classroom? Can we support the teachers with how to use those devices? Can we support the parents on how to manage the students' use of those devices out of school time? And can we actually develop and have access to resources that we can put onto those devices to make their learning effective through the use of those devices. So while this was at a national level, you could see that the same process would apply at a classroom level, or a school level, or a statewide level. And the rest is pretty much just how they went about doing that and the challenges that they overcame, the different PD programs that they put in place to help teachers. So not just in how to use the device, but how to teach effectively, the pedagogy in using the devices, how to create resources that could go on the devices, how to use a virtual learning environment, a learning management system facilitated by the devices, and also how to manage the devices and use them in a classroom or in the schools. So how to manage their battery recharge cycles, how to manage student disruption and classroom management so that they're not wasting their time doing other things other than learning processes. Elements at a national level that you would maybe look at a school level. And then some of the big issues, how to afford it. If you're doing this for a classroom, how could you afford to do that for your classroom? How could you raise the money or seek the money? It may be through grants, it may be through the PNC, it may be through a BYOD program, or various other approaches. Now, people will ask you whether or not it's a good idea and may disagree with your implementation plan. And so you need to have a rationale and justification for making such large-scale changes and be able to support those changes, ideally through evidence from research and other policy statements. One of the big things that you're going to do in your implementation plan is identify the stakeholders and how to actually get them on side by working out what they want to see from your implementation plan being conducted. We'll talk more about those in later weeks. The rest is about the actual implementation, and we won't worry too much about that aspect. But the final thing I mentioned just in passing now is around monitoring and evaluation the change. It's easy to come up with a plan, and it's relatively easy to implement a plan, but actually having your plan be sustainable over a number of years and then to eventually develop into a new plan and be evolved out of is an important aspect, because too often plans are conceived of and implemented and then just fall apart as the people that advocated them move on or leave, or just people lose interest, and a whole range of other aspects around educational policy. So that's a fairly brief overview of an implementation plan used in a particular country. But does anyone have any comments or thoughts on that? By next week, hopefully you'll have read that and we can discuss it in a little bit more detail as we go on to some of the other aspects. Yes, Emma, the structure of any major educational reform or any reform process is fairly standardized now, but there's a lot of complexity in them, and there's different approaches that have been shown to be effective, in particular identifying the barriers and the reasons why some plans have failed in the past, and then incorporating those into your strategies so that yours is more likely to succeed. And there's some of the things we'll be exploring in later weeks.
One thing I did notice at the end of that chapter is that even though like, they did it really quickly, but it still comes back to where they're saying that you need to provide the correct training for the teachers and technical support and pedagogical support, which is the same thing I keep hearing over and over.
It is.
Even if you're trying to do it really quickly or do it slowly, you still have to make sure that the teachers are supported in the process, whether it's quick or slow.
Absolutely, and there are some fundamental aspects of any scaled approach, and they all have the same fundamentals. And being able to prepare your stakeholders, But it's not just the teachers. There's also the parents. There's the students. There can also be your own general community. There can even be the political system. So there's like the new introduction of the coding and robotics programs into schools faced a lot of political pressure here in Australia. Of course, there was a change that not everyone was on board with initially. So that'll be part of where you will identify your stakeholders and work out what they need to see happen to get on board with supporting your proposed changes and how they can get benefit from the changes. Because indeed, there's a lot of schools where they didn't embrace engaging with the students. And they're now finding that they don't want to have iPad or tablet programs, particularly as they move into the senior years. They find that the students find that they'd prefer to use laptops because of the extra capabilities of laptops at that level. Where if they were incorporated more in the early stages of the planning process, those aspects could have been identified and accommodated in the planning processes. And that said, for some younger students, they actually prefer simpler devices, sometimes even simpler than the iPads, the more simple tablet devices, which offer fewer options, but in some ways more engaging for very young children. So other thoughts?
It just makes me consider if there's actually a good implementation plan. Because by the sounds of it, you know, it'll be shot down pretty quickly from certain stakeholders, or there's lots of gaps, or you know, they haven't set it up to be sustainable for the future if someone moves on, or all these other aspects sort of fall into place. I guess there's no, I mean, while the structure seems easy to follow, it may not be the best overall in the end, if that makes sense.
Well, Jason was saying that it's the stakeholders. I've seen it happen really well in a school, and the reason it worked really well in that school and why it was a huge success is the way they communicated to all stakeholders, and they made sure that everyone was involved in it, and they felt that it was a decision that everyone was making, and it wasn't a decision that was just led by, say, the principal at the school or a number of teachers.
Yes, and that's the big challenge. And when you come up with your implementation plan, one of your first initial challenges will be to actually get your principal or the leadership on board. And they'll have certain things that they'll want to see. Some of it may be around, does it help them get their next promotion? Does it save money for the school? There'll be certain aspects that they are keenly interested in. One advantage we have in education is that most educators, if we can show value to student learning, will tend to get on board with things like that. But that won't necessarily sway the business manager in a school, who will want to see very different aspects being accommodated. And it may not sway certain parental groups who may have other issues that they're concerned with. So there are a whole lot of different factors, and part of your analysis is working out all the different stakeholders. What are the things that they would be potentially opposed to about your proposed changes, and how you could address those concerns or modify your plan to take into account their opposition to various aspects that may occur. Now, it'll never be perfect for everyone. Because we've got such diversity in human beings, there'll always be some aspects, but being able to identify them and minimize them also means that you can prepare arguments to overcome various aspects. And some of it will be around just convincing, and sometimes even just pushing through barriers. But where possible, it's much better if you can get everyone on board. And if you can show them advantages from their perspectives, then they'll get on board and become advocates for the change, and it becomes far, far easier, rather than just one or two people having to be the continuous advocates for change. Because then you get problems if they move on, or if they lose heart or interest, then the system falls apart. And generally, champions for change can only sustain it for a number of years. And in particular, when we looked at those ideas around the early adopters and the innovators, one of the problems of innovators and early adopters is that they want to move on to the next innovation and the next early adoption. Once something starts to become mainstreamed, they're no longer particularly interested in it. So they're actually really bad to be long-term champions, because they're off looking at the very next new thing and wanting to see that implemented. So you need to have a whole range of other groups involved in sustaining a change over the period of time needed for it to become embedded and part of a culture of an organization. But again, things that we're going to be discussing over the next few weeks. Other thoughts?
I think for different plan structure, it takes time consuming and finance consuming. So it takes it's not a short time scheme. You need to persuade people, just like principal and parents, even students, to be interested in your plan. And then you have to get financial support, for example, software and technicians, every factor you need to consider. So it's a kind of very detailed, I think it's detailed plan. And you have to set a kind of long-term goal and short-term goal. So to achieve the goal one by one, so that you can achieve the plan, think year by year, and then make a great achievement finally.
Yes, that's correct, Eric. And it really depends on when you set your goals. Now, if you're looking at, say, a plan for a classroom, now your initial goal may be to have every student using an iPad device to improve their reading ability and to engage with lots of different reading texts. Now, that's a fairly short-term goal, but it could be on the way to more ambitious goals. Now, ideally, though, you should identify those ambitious goals and then work back. So it may be for every student to be learning at 2 grade levels above the national average. And then start thinking through, okay, what could be done to achieve that? Now, one of the very first things might be to improve their access to reading material and to engage them more with reading material. But once they've achieved that, then you might move on to students writing their own material and engaging with the processes of digital publishing. And then the step beyond that might be to using other genres, such as creating video games and movies as a way of expressing their ideas and so forth. And then that all continues to work towards achieving your overall aim. And sometimes you may not even be able to see the final steps towards that overall aim, but you can start the process moving. And it may be that in 5 years' time, you might only be able to plan out 5 years' time, but then you start at that stage, you know that there'll be new technology, or the school will have a better understanding of how then to take things forward. Of course, one of the big aspects around change management that often causes it to fail is that you have one plan that doesn't change. Any really good plan should be designed to be updated and modified every couple of years. Now, in communist environments in China, they do a 5-year plan. And every 5 years, they then revisit their plan and change it to adapt to different circumstances. Now, if they just stuck to the 5-year plan that they first had after their revolution, then they'd still be in an agricultural industry. But of course, they change their plan every 5 years. They've now gone through industrial revolutions. Now they're up to information technology revolutions and going beyond that. So the same in any organization and down into a classroom. Yes, you may have your 2 to 3 year plan and a 5-year plan, and then you continuously update that as you become better at planning and better at managing these change processes. But yes, even though we do develop very detailed, complex plans, we should never think of them as static plans. They're dynamic environments because we continuously learn about them. But the other aspect that Eric did touch on is they need to be resilient plans. And that means they need to be resilient to people, and people may change. They may change their interest and move on to different schools, and new people may come in. And having a plan that is able to accommodate everyone's differences as they change can be a real problem, particularly in schools which are very leadership dominant. If you have a new principal come on board, often they want to make changes because that's part of their role. So a really good plan should incorporate what happens when a new leader comes in, and they can then modify the plan, or at least seemingly modify the plan, so that they can take ownership and be engaged with the plan. But that starts getting into some fairly complex nuances. But it's an important aspect of human behavior, because large organizations change rapidly and slowly. Sometimes they can change too rapidly, when you've got leadership comes in and wants to make change simply for the sake of making change. And sometimes they can change too slowly because of resistance just builds up and they just become adverse to changes. Anyone got any experiences or comments to make on any of those aspects? Okay then. Yes, plans need to be changed sometimes according to the situations. Yes, Eric. Okay, let's look at the final document then, which is a summary of some of the other aspects that we've explored in terms of chapter 1. And it was really just meant to make sure you read chapter 1 more than once. So this just goes through, again, the idea of how ICT has changed dramatically in our society. And this can be part of the rationale you put in place for the changes that you want to make for your own school or educational organization. The fact that ICT is changing constantly, the fact that technology is always having a big impact upon society, does give us very strong justification for implementing changes to the use of ICT in schools, if only to accommodate students' learning about how to cope with change. Now, part of that also can be to help teachers learn how to cope with change, but in general in education, if something is related to students, we're more likely to adopt it. Teachers will do a lot of things if they can see benefits to their students. They won't necessarily do the same things if they can only see benefits to themselves. But telecommunication changes have been a major part of changes in the world and how things have adjusted. Again, we've got the various aspects around different economies and countries, but you can also equate those to your own schools. Now, this mass production to information technology paradigm can also be related to education, where we've moved, or in some cases we've moved, and hopefully we're slowly moving towards mass education, towards differentiated education, where we address the specific needs of different students, as opposed to just teaching all the students the same thing. Moving from a horizontal integration model, where we've got lots of hierarchical structures, to a decentralized model, where we've got lots of schools operating independently, such as the independent public schools now, which is a move towards that decentralization process. And the idea also, even within schools, of letting different teachers do different things with their classes. So while you may have a science curriculum, different teachers may have different strengths in their understanding of science. And so one teacher might be teaching physics from a space scientist perspective, and another teacher might be teaching physics from a more theoretical perspective on physics. You've got to move away from standardization towards interoperability and adaptability and diversity. So not everyone learning exactly the same thing. We did have a move back towards standardization with our testing regimes, but slowly that is moving more towards diversity. And the NAPLAN online tests are meant to increase that diversity. And a whole move away from centralization towards the interaction between local schools and the global village of educators. So rather than just all schools working towards a central authority for a state or having schools operate independently with their local communities, but also interact with other schools globally, not just with the other schools in their system. Okay, so that's probably the main aspects I wanted you to get from that paper. Any thoughts? These sessions are meant to be mostly you guys speaking, with me guiding the process, rather than me lecturing. You're getting tired. I'm getting tired, perhaps.
I think there's we're at a weird sort of time at the moment, jumping from like mass education to differentiation, where I think people are sort of teething with technology and how that works for that. And I don't think we're there yet, as in I think we're still at this really limbo between what was the past and what is now coming into the future. And I think there's a lot of unknown around how we change and what's the effective way, and hence why there's so many plans being offered or methods being offered at the moment. So that's sort of my thoughts on that.
No, you're absolutely right. And the whole differentiation, individualization, personalization agenda has been around for a long, long time. And it's always been incredibly difficult to achieve. They've been trying to do it since the 50s with, who was it? I'm trying to remember the professor that, where they first started trying to differentiate education and set up systems whereby students were learning about the real world, learning about how to operate a store or create their own garden and all of those elements. Trying to take it away from just purely a theoretical process of education where everyone learns the same knowledge, to allowing students to explore their own interests and develop their own project-based learning and all those other aspects that can lead to differentiation. And ideally, we'd get to a point whereby every student had their own learning program and were taught what they needed to learn, rather than having to sit in the same class and maybe learn things that they'd already learnt, or were trying to learn things that were too hard for them at their current stage of understanding and development. Technology does, though, offer an opportunity to try to achieve that, because we can differentiate through the use of technology. Most other attempts through paper-based systems and so forth have made minor approaches towards doing that. Some of you may have gone through school where you had various cards that you went and collected and did a whole lot of activities, and then you then complete that, then you go and do another card of activities, while different students were working on different activities depending upon their current progression. Another attempt at differentiation using a different sort of technology, in this case cards. But now we have lots of digital cards that provide different activities based upon students' progression. Emma mentions that there's a text by Gordon Tate on mass education. That's a good read. Absolutely, Emma. And mass education has been useful, particularly when we had mass industry. When you wanted to have lots and lots of people do the same thing, then it was useful to have an education system that prepared them to do that. And indeed, our education system really did come as a response to World War I, where we had to train millions of people how to run around and shoot rifles and survive on a battlefield. And many of our educational processes were developed in the training mechanisms that they developed for preparation of people to go to war. And they developed a very good system for doing that, that trained people very rapidly and very effectively, because literally their lives were on the line if they didn't learn things effectively. And you could quickly measure whether or not learning was effective, because you could tell how many people were dying based upon different systems of training. And that was all done. And we then applied that to the needs of industry at the time, where we had very large industries that needed very specialist skills and lots of people to do very specialized skills. So the training models developed for the military were able to be applied in that context. But we've now moved to industries that need very creative, specialized, or very creative, individualized skills. and a whole lot of other aspects where just having lots of people prepared to do low-level skills isn't sufficient. And so we're now trying to grapple with ways of transforming our education system to cope with that. Of course, in the past, before World War I and before that, our schools were very individualized. You would normally have one teacher with about a dozen students, and they could look after each individual need for each individual student, giving them different books to read, different activities to do. And in the main, the elites had individual tutors, individual teachers. It's only when we went to the idea of having everyone have an education that we then went to mass education and the consequences of that. And we're now trying to work out ways of getting back towards that more individual tuition-based processes. Now, we do the same at university. Universities are very epitomized by mass education. But that said, there was a time when universities were individualized. The Oxford system is a good example of that. When you go to Oxford, you get assigned an academic, and that academic has about 5 or 6 students, and they guide you through your entire degree. They give you books to read, they give you courses to go and do, they guide you through the learning process. Each student completely individualized. But most universities went towards a mass education model because it was very cost effective. Okay, let's get back to you guys asking questions and discussing things. So we've been looking at educational policies. What have been your experiences with educational policy? Surely someone's had some experience of educational policy. Having an impact upon you, or?
Are we talking in general?
In general, yes.
Okay, well NAPLAN is probably a go-to. And again, because I'm in a low SES area, we are painted as the second worst school nationally. And that doesn't bode very well for our reputation.
No, it wouldn't, by very nature. Yes, so that's a policy. Well, that was probably a combination of policies. The NAPLAN policy or process in itself wasn't necessarily designed to identify poor performing schools. It was designed to provide advice to teachers on their students to improve their performance. That said, it was a national data collection that was then able to be used by other policymakers to identify poor performing schools. And it was also around another big agenda around identifying poor performing teachers. And the idea was to try to actually move some of our poor performing teachers out of the system, which the assumption was then that we would improve the overall quality of teaching by removing the lower performing parts. So the average would go up by that process. And governments spent a fair bit of time trying to work out ways of doing that. They still haven't come up with a good model for achieving that, but that's still on the agenda by a number of policymakers. But it wasn't initially intended to be the use of the NAPLAN testing. So it's, yeah, NAPLAN has gotten a bad name for a whole range of reasons, but mostly because of how it's been used by other people to promote their own particular policy agendas. But what are people's thoughts around that, or other policies? Now, curriculum is a policy. You may have been impacted by the Australian curriculum, or at the university level, there's various policies around different types of courses that have been developed at university level. There's the Privacy Act policy. Damien, what aspect of the Privacy Act have you found impacting?
It's to do with how data is stored and used by students and whether that will be in breach of the Privacy Act.
Yes, that's a very interesting one for Education Queensland schools, where they've used a very obscure Queensland law that implies that data on students should be kept within the boundaries of Queensland. They ignore the fact that that law is broken almost continuously, including by NAPLAN, and lots of other data collection processes. But it's used as the excuse to restrict the use of other tools that they decide not to allow available for use within Queensland. But it's coming under more and more difficulty because there was a whole range of policies and processes put in place to around that. Initially, it was fundamentally that the education IT group had a lot of power and basically wanted to be in control of any technology that was used in Queensland schools and any other technology that was developed by another company, such as Google or something else. They wanted to replicate themselves. In the main, it provided them with secure employment and lots of work to do. About a few years ago, they had a dramatic budget cut, and really that policy now has no legs to stand on and is disintegrating. The entire learning management system and environment that was created as a result of those policies hasn't seen an upgrade now for 3 or 4 years. Well, in fact, the upgrade was developed 3 or 4 years ago, but was never implemented because they didn't have enough money to finish it. But they were going to create their own virtual worlds and lots of other stuff, which was all done. I've been involved in a number of projects as part of all of that, but because everyone was reassigned and the budget was so dramatically cut, it wasn't ever implemented. So they've been working on a skeleton staff maintaining the an out-of-date system, and slowly allowing more and more other technologies to be used because they can no longer really justify restricting them. And yes, it has a high impact on learning and a continuing impact on learning. And part of that is a consequence of other policies, such as the issues around when things go wrong in schools. The minister gets involved, and schools policy leaders at certain levels become terrified of ministers getting involved and having ministerials. And whenever something goes bad in a school, such as it becomes publicly known that the students have been looking at something they shouldn't be looking at on the internet, someone in the public contacts the minister. The minister then gets in contact with the schools involved, and suddenly we have policies that shut down a whole lot of things. But there can be policies then put in place by reasoned approaches that can be made resilient to those immediate impacts. And as ministers get involved in developing really good, robust policies, and departments of education and so forth learn how to manage those environments and understand that just doing a knee-jerk reaction to things isn't necessarily the best approach, then things can happen more effectively. But that takes time. And because we live in this world of technological innovation, there's always new things happening that can be problematic. So there was a stage, in fact, I've still got the email, well, I've got the letter that banned the use of email in New South Wales schools. It was in the 1990s, and email was still fairly new, and something went wrong. And so the message was sent out to all schools, no email, absolutely not, by anyone. But that's the nature of any new innovation. If you don't understand it and you haven't been shown its advantages and strengths and beneficial uses, then you'll have these negative aspects. We saw that with the introduction of the iPads, and it's still ongoing with screen time concerns and a whole lot of other issues. And we'll continue to see that with new technologies. And that's another aspect you need to build into your implementation plans, thinking through what negative perceptions there'll be from the different stakeholders and working out strategies to counteract those. And yes, there are policies around rural and remote areas. And in fact, rural and remote areas can actually get some advantages because there are a whole range of strategies designed to help overcome the disadvantages that rural and remote communities have. So while it seems a bit strange, but disadvantaged schools and rural and remote schools and those in low socioeconomic areas can often have greater access to technology and other processes to help do things than average schools. You still got the wealthy schools. They tend to have their own processes and you can't really compete with the advantages they have. But in terms of access to resources, truly disadvantaged schools often have greater access than just the average school. Well, it relates to funding, but policy drives funding. And you have to have a good, any policy that's developed will direct where funding, and funding is simply just an acknowledgement of the importance of various policies. So we've just seen the state minister provide $18 million to have a digital champion in every school and an ICT technician in every Queensland school from next year, because they've seen that as a particular priority area, and the policy documents that have been developed have been around strategies to improve the teaching of digital technologies and computing in schools. And so those policies now need to be funded, and the policy has convinced the powers that be, and they've now funded them. But the same happens in a school. If you've got to convince your principal to provide funds and support for a particular approach that you want to use, then you need to have the policy in place which convinces them that it will be effective. And Emma, I suspect you may be a bit ironic in your statement about PD opportunities. Generally, that's an area where remote communities don't have a lot of access around PD. It's, so sending monies to remote communities is a lot easier than sending PD opportunities. It does sometimes happen, but it's oh, you do have a lot of PD. Oh, that's great. Because in the main, that's an area where remote communities have had the major problems, mostly just because of distance and distribution of people, where even if you hold something in one town, it may be 2 hours drive for the other surrounding schools to gather for the PD. And yes, now in terms of money to attend PD and to do things, yes, you often do have greater support from that respect, simply because it's acknowledged that there are far fewer opportunities, so the school needs to support what opportunities there are. Okay then, well, we're coming to the end of our time. Is there any other issues from this evening that you'd like to raise?
One question, Jason. I just want to ask about the result of the Delphi survey. So how do we use the result of that survey? Do we need to put all of the results into the appendices?
Okay. In terms of your results from your Delphi survey, what you'll do is, I'm just bringing up your assignments, is you're going to talk about what your expert opinions were and what they thought about the challenges. And then you're going to consider those perspectives based upon your system model and the challenges you've identified. So there's 2 sections in the assignment where you unpack what your experts have said, and then you relate those to the challenges that you've identified. So you may include some tables in your in appendices, but you need to really talk about what your experts have contributed to your understanding of the challenges related to the questions that you've asked. Does that make some sense?
Yeah, so we just need to, so when we mention the results, the data we use in the assignment, do we need to? So we just use the table or graph in the assignment and.
Well, how you relate that, there's various approaches you can do. So say if your experts have given a very clear consensus around a particular aspect of the questions, then you might include a table or a graph that shows that. But what I really want to see is you talking about what that means in terms of the questions that you've asked. What does it mean that the experts feel this? How does that then relate to the challenge? So if they were 50-50 on it, then that tells you another big thing, that there's a wide variety of views about that issue, and that some people are for and some people are against. So that would be an area that could be very problematic in an implementation plan, because you've got half of them on both sides. Where it's a bit easier if everyone's against or everyone's for, you can then clearly make decisions around that. But there's a whole range of different considerations depending upon what the data is that you generate.
Okay, so you don't need to look at the results. We just need to mention, we need to explain in our assignment.
Yes, well, that will involve looking at the results. So I'm just not too sure what you mean by looking at the results.
Like how much percentage of participants' choices will affect my explanation, yeah, just like that.
What I'm saying is you don't just include the data from the 1,000 Minds survey. Yes, you can include that data, but you need to unpack and explain what that data means, what the results mean. So it's fine to include it, but you shouldn't just stop there. You need to actually explain what that then tells you about the problem and about the issues related to the questions that you've asked.
Oh, I see. Just to further explain, no, what I mean is just to develop my explanation based on data. Is that correct?
Yes. Okay, so next week we're going to be talking about educational leadership models and strategies, and ways that we can support change in an organization through good leadership. So, ask questions via the discussion forum during the week. Otherwise, I'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.